At the end of our last episode, dive teams re-entered the water in Richmond, no longer searching for Laci Peterson's body, but hoping to recover her missing head and limbs from the San Francisco Bay. Laci was nearly 8 months pregnant when she vanished on Christmas Eve, and when a baby was found near the shoreline on April 13th, Richmond police suspected a possible connection. When a badly decomposed female torso turned up the following day, they were sure it belonged to Laci. Her remains were in such poor condition it took 3 days and a stroke of good luck to officially identify Laci and her unborn son Connor. But there was little doubt who Jane and Baby Doe were when they were found. And where they were found left no question as to how they wound up in the water. All fingers pointed to Laci's unfaithful husband Scott long before their bodies were recovered, in large part due to his affair with Amber Fry and the lies he told to maintain it. Scott maintained his innocence throughout the investigation as well. However, detectives compiled a long list of circumstantial evidence against him as the search for Laci drew on. Ultimately, it was Scott's fortuitous alibi that sealed his fate with the jury. He told police a dozen times in his many interviews that he was fishing in the bay the morning Laci vanished, trolling his new boat through the shallows of Brooks Island. Finding Laci and Connor so close to the island's eastern shore lent tremendous weight to the probable cause against him, more than enough to secure a warrant for his arrest and confirm Scott Peterson's status as the most hated man in America. This is Dead to Me True Crime. 3 months and 21 days passed since Laci Peterson vanished from Modesto, and police hoped to gain conclusive proof of Scott's guilt when she was found on the 14th of April. But they wouldn't get it. Another extensive search of the water and coastline through the middle of June produced no evidence linking Scott to the scene or to Laci's demise. With no indication of homicide, fatal injury, or his involvement observed during autopsy, the medical examiner listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined for both Laci and Connor Peterson. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Allison Galloway surmised that Laci spent at least 90 of the 111 days she was missing at the mercy of the water, reducing her body to an empty torso by the time she was found. Pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson concluded the harsh environment and decomposition were not only responsible for the destruction of Laci's remains, but for Connor's separation from her womb. While no signs of foul play were discovered, the circumstantial evidence was strong enough for Stanislaus County to amend the cause of death for both victims. The DA's office filed formal complaints against Scott soon after. His premeditated crimes against Laci carried a minimum sentence of 25 years and opened the door to the gas chamber, but still left him a slim chance for parole. It was Connor who guaranteed his father would spend the rest of his life behind bars. California is one of 26 states to recognize a right to life for the unborn, regardless of viability or gestational age, if the child passes away as a result of harm to the mother. California also offers special circumstances for those who commit multiple homicides, allowing for one of two options if convicted: life in prison or a trip to death row. Without the second-degree charge for Connor, Scott could have gotten 25 years with a chance for parole in 2028, but that option never seemed likely. He was eventually convicted on both counts and condemned by a jury to die. 2 decades later, he's no longer in line for the gas chamber, and it's not clear if he knew death was on the table when Laci was found. But he dropped off the radar the same afternoon, and lead detective Craig Grogan had to call him some help with tracking him down. Special agents with the California DOJ were called in several hours after Laci was found, but Scott was long gone by then. Grogan had no way of knowing for sure, but suspected he may retreat south. With a significant lead on the DOJ and every motivation to flee, he felt if they didn't find him fast, Scott would slip out of their reach into Mexico. If he decided to run, Grogan couldn't stop him, and once he made it over the border, he knew justice for Laci and Connor could slip right away with him. Scott's chance of escape would still be extremely small south of the border, and most U.S. criminals are quickly caught and deported. Others face extradition, which takes longer but still ends with a journey back north. Scott's high-profile case and famous face would have most likely led to his immediate capture, but for Grogan, it was still a risk. Unfortunately, he had no choice but to take it, not knowing where Scott was and nowhere near ready to make an arrest if he did. An active warrant would have stopped Scott at the border if he were questioned, but Grogan didn't have one and didn't expect to anytime soon. The manner of death for Laci and Connor had to be modified by the coroner before the probable cause affidavit went in front of a judge, and Grogan knew the process would take days. But even if agents did have a warrant and knew where Scott was on the 15th of April, they'd have to hold off on the handcuffs. Grogan had orders from Modesto Police Chief Roy Wadston to postpone his arrest until Jane and Baby Doe were officially identified as Laci and Connor. Frustratingly for Grogan, the DNA results took longer than the change to their death certificates, and whether it was intentional or otherwise, the DOJ lab performing the testing seemed to work against him every step of the way. Much to his dismay, the lab announced their progress to the press, and Grogan feared confirmation of Laci and Connor's ID would trigger Scott to make a run for the border, if he hadn't already. With the obstacles delaying his arrest, Scott had ample time and opportunity to make it to Mexico, and Grogan knew he'd have no trouble getting in. Unless he were caught with a firearm, there'd be no cause to hold Scott at the crossing, and a U.S. warrant holds no power beyond its borders. The same holds true for law enforcement. If Scott made it to Mexico, Grogan and the DOJ would have no jurisdiction to follow, let alone make an arrest. However, there is one exception to this rule. U.S. authorities engaged in hot pursuit are permitted to detain a suspect within a reasonable distance of the border. Who and what defines reasonable would require more research, but most U.S. fugitives enter Mexico via far more subtle means. And when they do, it's the U.S. Marshals Service who picks up their trail. More than 50 U.S. Marshals patrol the border states of California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, while 24 more remain permanently stationed in Mexico City. The Marshals work closely with a host of other agencies to track, capture, and return fugitives over both sides of the border. The FBI maintains a field office in Mexico City as well and often assists with intelligence, but neither agency has the authority to make an arrest on foreign soil. While the FBI can request extraterritorial permissions to do so, the action has to be approved by Congress and is only utilized in extreme cases. Ultimately, it falls upon Mexican law enforcement to round up foreign fugitives, and they're well versed in the practice. The United States maintains extradition treaties with 116 countries. Not surprisingly, the treaty with Mexico gets the most use, with dozens of U.S. criminals returned north to face charges each year. But the number of cases continues to outpace resources, allowing many to slip through the cracks. One specialized branch of the Mexican State Police is particularly well known for sending more than 1,600 wanted Americans back over the border since its creation in 2002. The task force acquired a reputation for success and picked up a nickname early on. Officially established as the International Liaison Unit, the tight-knit group of 12 men became known among locals as the Gringo Hunters. The Gringo Hunters continue to capture and deport roughly 150 U.S. fugitives out of Mexico every year. American outlaws who can't be deported or extradited. On average, the Office of International Affairs has opened more than 700 extradition requests worldwide each year since 1990. But their caseload has grown over 100% since then, and nearly a third of those requests have or will go unresolved. Roughly 3,000 criminals remain at large in foreign countries from the U.S. alone. With no warrant or clue where he was on the 15th of April, Grogan couldn't do much to prevent Scott from joining them. His family became a concern when he vanished as well. With two siblings and parents with resources living just north of the border, Grogan couldn't be sure they wouldn't help Scott escape. The Petersons continue to support Scott's innocence to this day, and their lack of faith in the Modesto PD has always been made very clear. His parents, Jackie and Lee, were particularly vocal throughout the investigation, claiming detectives failed Laci by targeting their innocent son. Jackie refused to believe Jane and Baby Doe had any connection to Laci and Connor until proven otherwise, and for Jackie and the Petersons, their recovery near Brooks Island could only mean one thing: Scott was being framed by Laci's true killer. Scott's mother passed away in 2013, but she went to her grave defending her son, and his surviving family still refuses to accept his involvement. His 84-year-old father, Lee, maintains high hopes for his recent return to the courtroom. With a fresh legal team and support from the LA Innocence Project, Scott claims to have new evidence that will clear his name and prove he'd been set up from the start. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episode so far, and hit the bell so you don't miss upcoming updates on the status of Scott's latest appeal for a new trial. While he wasn't able to officially confirm Jane and Baby Doe were Laci and Connor, Detective Grogan did attempt to notify Scott of their discovery on the 14th of April, but his calls went unanswered and unreturned. The detective was back on the witness stand the following morning, concluding his testimony for the state in an unrelated homicide case. It was his last day in court, but he'd be stuck in Modesto for at least 2 more, renewing the wiretap on Scott's phone and completing the affidavit for his arrest. While physically unable to join the hunt, Grogan remained in communication with the agents searching for Scott, but he and his colleagues, John Bueller and Al Brocchini, had long-standing plans to serve the warrant in person. The detectives were ready and willing to travel when the time came in order to witness Scott's arrest, but they'd have to settle for field reports until then. The first update from agents came with the discovery of his truck in San Diego. However, it wasn't much of a discovery because the DOJ already knew it was there, and Grogan knew Scott wouldn't be found with it. The Modesto PD attached a GPS tracker to the Dodge Dakota while it was parked at the airport back in January, and it was still transmitting data. But Scott found the device soon after it was installed, and the truck wound up with his brother John in Ocean Beach. Their mother Jackie later claimed John planned to buy the Dakota or take over the payments, a statement that becomes more relevant after Scott's arrest. Scott's older half-brother John lived with his wife Allison in an apartment on Lotus Street in Ocean Beach, San Diego. Special Agent Alex Quick was assigned to run surveillance on the residence after confirming the Dakota was parked there on the 14th. How long Scott's truck had been in John's possession is unknown, but he'd been caring for Mackenzie for months by then. Scott and Laci's golden retriever moved in with John and Allison in early February, 2 weeks after Scott left their home in Modesto to stay with his half-sister Ann Bird in Berkeley. But a few weeks living with Ann was a few too many for her husband Tim, and Scott was soon back on the move. He lived out of duffel bags and borrowed vehicles as he cycled visits between family and friends, most of which Grogan had tabs on, including Ann. Scott still stayed with her in Berkeley often enough for detectives to make note of her Shasta Road address, but Grogan didn't know she'd given her little brother access to other properties, addresses he and his colleagues knew nothing about. She gave Scott the keys to her parents' cabin on Lake Arrowhead less than a month after he moved in, mainly because tensions with Tim came to a head when he learned about Amber Fry. Ann was interviewed by Detective Grogan soon after that, wherein she refused to tell him where Scott was staying. Fast forward to early April, just 2 weeks before Laci was found, Ann gave Scott the keys to her parents' primary residence in Point Loma, another address Grogan and the DOJ knew nothing about. Tom and Jerry Grady were Ann's adoptive parents, and Scott took refuge in their home after his wife was found on the shoreline, spending the better part of the next 48 hours just under Agent Quick's nose in Ocean Beach. Growing up in and around San Diego, Scott still had friends who lived in the city, and agents kept a close eye on them after he disappeared, but their main focus settled on his parents and siblings. Jackie, Lee, and his half-sister Susan all owned property in North County, San Diego, an area well known for its stunning scenery, gated communities, and million-dollar homes. Jackie and Lee lived in Solana Beach, a particularly affluent section of the North Valley coastline, and Lee's crating business 30 minutes west in Poway is still operational today. Scott's older half-sister Susan Caudillo lived in an exclusive neighborhood on private property in Escondido, 20 minutes north of her father's business. And we already know his half-brother John lived in Ocean Beach, nowhere near North County, but within walking distance of Tom and Jerry's house in Point Loma. After finding Scott's truck and running surveillance on John's apartment through half the night on the 14th, Agent Quick went off duty for a few hours' rest. He returned for debriefing at sunrise, and with no activity reported from Lotus Street, Quick made the drive from Ocean Beach to Poway, hoping Scott might pay a visit to his father at work. He parked on Brookprinter Place with a good view of the entrance to San Diego crating and watched. It wasn't long before John pulled Scott's truck into the lot instead. The agent watched and waited a while longer. When he reappeared and the truck pulled away, Quick decided to follow, hoping he might lead to Scott. But John only led him right back to Lotus Street, where Special Agent Alex Quick summarized his report for Grogan back in Modesto and settled in for another fruitless night of surveillance on the 15th. With no productive news from San Diego and no data coming in from the wiretap on Scott's phone, Grogan spent that evening reviewing the affidavit he'd prepared for his warrant. The detective was drawn to the portions relayed by the pathologist, expanding on his notes surrounding the tan maternity pants Laci still wore at autopsy. Dr. Peterson recalled that the remaining scraps of material were shredded and stained so badly his criminalist John Nelson nearly mistook the garment for shorts and struggled a bit to pinpoint the color as well. Nelson documented their color as tan, but Grogan was only interested in the fact that they weren't black. He considered the number of times Scott described Laci's clothing the last time he saw her, and it dawned on him. He must have truly never expected her remains to be found. Scott claimed his wife was already dressed when he woke up on Christmas Eve, telling Grogan and countless others that Laci wore a long-sleeve white t-shirt and black yoga pants when he left the house for his fishing trip that morning. The tan capris she was found in posed later issues for Scott's defense, but they were the only welcome news Grogan had that day. The inconsistency would not only strengthen the warrant affidavit and serve to discredit Scott, but refute eyewitnesses who saw Laci walking Mackenzie in black pants long after his cell phone pinged at the warehouse. We'll discuss the testimony surrounding these points and many others during an upcoming summary of the twists, turns, and dramas within Scott's trial. Hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss our follow-up episode on his defense and recent appeals for a new one, including motions filed by the Los Angeles Innocence Project and a look at the DNA evidence his new attorneys claim could set Scott free. DNA played a massive role in 2003 as well, particularly during the days leading up to Scott's arrest. Confirming Laci and Connor's identification took center stage for Grogan as the agents worked to track him down. A sample taken from Laci at autopsy was in such poor condition, viability testing was still underway on the 15th, leaving the media clamoring for updates by day's end. But Grogan knew if the lab briefed the press on their progress, they'd tip his hand to Scott in the process. Every major network hosted analysts and experts to explain the methods of both law enforcement and the justice system to the public. They spoke in depth and often on topics of capital punishment, DNA, legal defense, and potential reasons why Scott still walked free. Many predicted his arrest would come on the heels of a DNA match for Laci and Connor, and that's precisely what Chief Wasden had planned. The last thing Grogan needed was a positive update on her DNA sample to go along with it. If Scott caught wind of the progress at the lab and had experts to predict what would follow, he'd have even more incentive to run. On the afternoon of April 15th, Grogan reached out to the DOJ lab supervisor, John Tonkin, to explain the risk. He asked Tonkin to suppress the results of the viability testing for at least 48 hours, buying more time for their own agents to find Scott. From what Grogan could tell, the conversation went well, and Tonkin assured him progress from the lab would be kept under wraps until Scott was in custody. Unfortunately, Tonkin's word didn't hold, and the mounting pressure on Grogan increased tenfold with the events of the following day. The 16th of April began on a promising note with an early morning lead on Scott in San Diego, but Grogan was a bit taken aback by the source. The intel on his location hadn't come from the 6 special agents sent out to find him, but the wiretap, which was strange because it hadn't picked up a thing since going live the evening before. Grogan suspected Scott stopped using his cell phone when Laci was found, and the dead wiretap confirmed his theory. By that Wednesday morning, he'd given up on gaining anything useful from the recorded line, but Scott still managed to give up his location without touching his cell phone. While the wiretap data was a surprise, Grogan was even more shocked when it was traced back to the Grady's house in Point Loma. Scott's connection to Ann Bird and her parents quickly explained the La Cresta Drive address, but Grogan was a bit dumbfounded when he realized how close he'd been to the DOJ in Ocean Beach for the past day and a half. Of course, Agent Quick had no clue he was only 7 minutes away from John's apartment, but it seems Scott didn't know his brother's place was under surveillance either. If he hadn't dialed his voicemail from Tom and Jerry's landline, the 2 men would have likely crossed paths on Lotus Street that morning. However, Scott did use the Grady's house phone to check his voicemail, and when the wiretap picked up the number as an incoming call, Agent Quick was dispatched to Point Loma along with 5 other agents. Oddly enough, as he and his colleagues arrived in the La Cresta Drive neighborhood to watch the Grady house, Scott set out on a stroll to visit his brother in Ocean Beach. Agent Sonia Ramos spotted him several blocks away from the Point Loma neighborhood on foot and heading west at 9:45 a.m. Unfortunately, Scott spotted her minutes later, and the promising morning slipped into chaos by mid-afternoon. The main point of surveillance was to covertly monitor Scott until Grogan could make an arrest. The 6 agents on duty had orders to watch him from afar, but the operation backfired when Agent Ramos blew their cover, and Scott made it clear he wasn't interested in being followed. Ramos fell in behind Scott as he made the 40-minute walk from Point Loma to Ocean Beach, and when he noticed her white Honda Accord was still behind him as he drew closer to Lotus Street, he cut through an alley and switched directions. Ramos came out on a cross street to find Scott standing on the opposite corner, waving as she drove by. Knowing she'd been compromised, Ramos updated his location through the radio, and Agent Quick picked up his trail on foot, following him the rest of the way to John's apartment. Quick couldn't be sure whether or not he'd been spotted, but it wouldn't be the last encounter either agent would have with Scott before his arrest. Exactly how and when Scott returned to the Grady house that morning is unclear, but we know he was back there by 11 a.m., because that's when he confronted Agent Ron Schweitzer on the street. Schweitzer was parked several houses down La Cresta Drive when Scott backed an unfamiliar vehicle out of the garage. The agent was leaning over the passenger seat of his unmarked white Pontiac when Scott pulled a blue Lexus up to his driver's side window. Scott later claimed Schweitzer was trying to hide, while the agent said he was simply reaching for something on the floor. Either way, Scott was already asking questions by the time Schweitzer sat up. He wanted to know what agency he was with: state police, San Diego PD, FBI, what? He told him he didn't know what he was talking about, but Scott easily saw through the lie. Right, he said. Well, I've seen you guys following me all morning. The agent caught the plate number as Scott drove away, and the Lexus came back registered to Geraldine Grady. Special Agent Kevin Coble had a similar interaction with him just 5 minutes later. Scott was still in the Point Loma neighborhood when Coble fell in behind Geraldine's car, but after a few turns, he put the Lexus in park at a stop sign and got out. The agent scrambled to cover the radio notes and maps laid out on his passenger seat as Scott approached him at 11:05. That was a real nice block maneuver from the green minivan, he was saying as Coble put down his window. He knew the driver of the green van was a fellow agent, but like Schweitzer before him, Coble tried to maintain his cover, telling Scott he didn't know anything about block maneuvers or a van. Scott wasn't buying it, and the agent realized he'd been taking some notes of his own. "What was the plate number on that green van?" Scott asked as he glanced at the notepad he brought from the car. "I can't remember the exact numbers." Pen in hand, he rattled off the first part of the plate and looked back at Coble expectantly. "I didn't quite catch the end." Coble played dumb, but Scott persisted, wanting to know what agency he was with and why he was being surveilled. He was annoyed when the agent didn't budge, implying they'd just been going the same direction. "Yeah, whatever," Scott said as he walked back to the car. Now forced to drop off his trail, Coble radioed his location to the team so another agent could take his place, but the closest car belonged to Agent Sonia Ramos, and Scott quickly recognized her when she dropped into traffic behind him. He'd gotten away from her on foot during his walk that morning, and he promptly lost her again in Jerry's Lexus. But rather than stay lost, Scott circled around the block to get behind her. He followed Ramos for a mile or two before pulling up next to her at a stoplight. He stared at her as the cross-traffic passed and honked the horn when the light changed. She didn't follow. Ramos allowed him to proceed forward as she turned down a side street and sent the call to hand off to another agent. That was around 11:30 a.m. on the 16th, and once again, we don't have the surveillance details for Scott's return to the Grady house, but we do know he was back there by early afternoon. Several agents watched the exits on Lake Cresta Drive, expecting he might lead them around Point Loma again sometime that day, but Scott had something far more audacious in mind for his next outing. Likely full of confidence after losing agents on foot and by car that morning, he'd hatched a brazen new plan by that afternoon, one that would buy him another 36 hours of freedom and leave Grogan high and dry with his colleagues in Modesto. The 6 agents on duty tried to remain unseen as they positioned themselves around the Grady house. Around 1 p.m., the garage door began to creep open. Those within eyeshot sent word over the radio that there was movement out front, but none were prepared for what came next. The automatic door was still rising when a motorcycle screamed down the driveway and slipped around the corner. Agents had no time to react and scrambled to cover all directions, hoping to cast a net around the neighborhood. A few kept him in view for several blocks, but his speed and unpredictable driving increased, and one by one, they lost sight of the bike. California Attorney General Bill Locklear immediately dispatched 4 additional agents to assist, but it would take the 10 of them another day and a half to pin Scott back down. His dramatic getaway led to all manner of speculations over where he'd gone, but Detective Grogan felt all signs now clearly pointed to Mexico, and by sundown on the 16th, he feared the DOJ lab and its agents may have unintentionally paved the way. With the loss of the covert advantage, the fruits of surveillance turned sour, leaving Scott to toy with the agents before escaping with the upper hand. But the bad news just kept coming. Scott not only changed his appearance, but had access to vehicles and resources Grogan didn't know about, and the situation was about to get worse. Not only did DOJ agents blow their cover within minutes of finding Scott that morning and lose his trail twice before noon, it wasn't long after his final escape on the bike that the lab in Ripon announced plans for a press conference. The DOJ lab intended to broadcast a live update on Laci's DNA to millions of viewers, and the timing just could not have been worse. Even in hiding, Scott was sure to get word of the news, and if Laci's sample was viable, Grogan felt he would head for the border for sure. For all he knew, Scott was already cruising through Mexico on the mysterious motorcycle from the Grady's garage. Because none of the agents got the plate number, Grogan didn't even know who owned the bike. And technically, they couldn't even say with 100% certainty that Scott was the rider, because they never saw his face. However, even with the helmet, there was no real question that it was Scott. It'd clearly been a male, matching his stature and wearing the same colored clothing, who sped off on the bike. Of course, Scott was never seen at the Grady's again either. Grogan likely wished it had been someone dressed like Scott who'd gotten away, and he was on edge over the press conference scheduled for that afternoon. He called the lab in Ripon for the second time, intending to do everything he could to stop it. It's not clear who he spoke with this time, but Grogan was once again promised the lab would not only cancel their announcement for that afternoon, but hold all media updates for at least 48 hours. He felt the weight on his shoulders lessen a bit after the call, but not much, and certainly not for long. He took a frustrating call from a colleague soon after. The press conference aired anyway, broadcast to a national audience as scheduled and without warning. Grogan tuned in to watch lab spokesman Nathan Baranican confirm Laci's DNA sample was viable and that testing would move forward, but there was more. Baranican committed to another press briefing, promising to verify or exclude Laci Ann Connor's DNA within the next 48 hours. While Grogan was relieved to know the sample was viable, it was hard to celebrate the victory. Whether difference of opinion or miscommunication was to blame was never made clear, but Baranican's announcement flipped Grogan's request on its head, adding even more pressure to find Scott within a 2-day time frame. With no control over what would and wouldn't be released to the media, he made no further calls to the lab or attempts to delay the test results. The regrettable day dissolved into darkness, and with no sign of Scott by sunrise on the 17th, Grogan met with Chief Wasden to regroup. The chief slated new rules of engagement for agents in San Diego and approved travel plans for Grogan, Bueller, and Brocchini to join them and eventually make an arrest. Of course, they'd have to find Scott again first, and after his dramatic escape, Wasden wasn't willing to risk him making another. He advised agents to resume covert surveillance if they could track him down. Preferably they'd operate with more stealth during their next attempt at following Scott, but Wasden made himself clear. If they were to maintain visual contact by any means necessary, even if their cover was blown. Grogan expected a signature on his warrant to come through that day or the next and planned to travel south with Bueller and Brocchini as soon as the ink was dry. Wasden reminded his detectives that his previous orders would stand, even with warrant in hand. Neither they nor the DOJ had clearance to apprehend Scott without confirmation of Laci and Connor's DNA. But this time round, the chief offered an exception. If Scott got too close to the border, all bets were off, and Grogan could call for his arrest. Fortunately, Wasden, Grogan, and the DOJ were able to keep Scott's location and escape close to the vest, successfully shading his whereabouts from the media and the public. Laci's family was never aware he'd been found in the first place, let alone lost again. And her father Dennis spoke about his arrest and his faith in law enforcement as Scott enjoyed his last day of freedom on the 17th of April. That's what I want, is some justice done here. Dennis Rocha was a reserved and private man. He didn't participate in many personal interviews or make guest appearances as the search for Laci drew on, nor after it reached its grim conclusion. But he stepped out of his comfort zone a dozen times to plead for his daughter's safe return. Dennis attended every press conference he could. He spoke at every vigil, fundraiser, and event the community held to help bring Laci home. He wore his broken heart on his sleeve as he conveyed the love and pain he felt for Laci and Connor. The anguish in his eyes was so palpable, onlookers often shared his tears. Dennis was clearly devastated and forever changed by Laci's loss, but his loathing and suspicion of Scott was obvious as well, even before he learned about Amber Fry. He'd made previous statements about Scott's dead eyes and guilty demeanor weeks before, and the radio interview Dennis took part in on the 17th of April was no different, though this time the suffering and rage shone through his voice rather than his eyes. Dennis began his interview with a WBZ TV reporter in Boston, searching for the right words to describe Laci and the sorrow that shrouded his family when she and Connor were found. But the questions soon turned to Scott, their marriage, and his affair. He knew the world was waiting for DNA to confirm it was Laci who'd been pulled from the water 3 days before, but Dennis had already accepted it was her, and he had no doubt how she got there. It was her husband, Scott, he said firmly. There wasn't a sliver of doubt or hesitation in his voice, and unlike Laci's mother, Sharon, Dennis suspected his son-in-law very early on. He always believed Scott and Laci got along well, though he didn't see them interact often. He'd never witnessed signs of trouble or tension between them. That's what he told detectives when his daughter disappeared. Initially, he suspected a stranger must have been to blame, but it didn't take long for Dennis to circle back round to Scott. Detectives revealed red flags surrounding Scott's boat and oddly timed fishing trip immediately after Laci vanished, and he'd already begun avoiding the family. Her father grew more frustrated and suspicious when Scott refused to interact with the media as well, expecting he would want to plead often and loudly for his wife's safe return. Then Dennis began to notice. Scott would no longer look him in the eye. He was already sure of his guilt by the time he learned about Amber Fry. That's what I want, is some justice done here, Dennis told the host. I can't see Scott being out there free. That would just eat me up. Laci's mother, Sharon, spent the 17th of April glued to the television, still in a haze of grief and shock as the images of a yellow tarp on the breakwater flashed across the screen. She knew Laci's remains lie on the rocks beneath. Sharon watched her body bag being carried to the coroner's van dozens of times over the past 3 days, as the clip played and replayed across local and cable news. Friends and family had to convince her not to make the drive out to Richmond, though she wanted so badly to be close to Laci and Connor. But Sharon wasn't alone in her grief. The networks broke up the coverage of the crime scene with footage of the growing memorial on Laci's front lawn. The collection of cards, flowers, stuffed animals, candles, and heartfelt messages was a visual expression of the city's communal grief, and it swelled larger by the hour. The people of Modesto were ready to express their feelings about Scott as well, and after a healthy dose of drama with police, they'd get a chance to share them in person. Sharon listened to experts speculate on DNA testing, legal strategy, and various approaches to Scott's arrest as the evening news coverage continued on the 17th. Detective Grogan may have heard some of the same as he packed a small bag from home for what he hoped would be a quick trip to San Diego. A judge signed off on the warrant late that afternoon, and Grogan picked up John Bueller, Al Brocchini, and their supervisor, Sergeant Alan Carter, late that evening. He and his colleagues traveled nonstop, arriving in San Diego just before dawn on the 18th of April, with a warrant they couldn't serve. Exhausted after driving all night, the men checked into a hotel around 4 a.m. for some rest. Agents still had no clue where Scott was when Grogan's head hit the pillow, but assured him they'd make contact if that changed. It'd been 36 hours since he fled from the Grady's, and only Scott knows what he did on the 17th. But according to an exotic dancer in the city, he spent at least part of his free time with her. The dancer said she was his girlfriend and that Scott showed up while she was working that Thursday night. She claimed the relationship had been brief, but if the rest of her police statement is accurate, they must have been somewhat serious. She said Scott came to the club where she danced to ask her to run away to Mexico with him, but she refused and never saw or heard from him again. She filed a report with police, but not until 4 days later, fearing that publicity would upset her employer and threaten her job. It's not clear why the woman was never called to testify for the state during his trial. Perhaps Scott was able to disprove her claims, or his defense won a motion to bar her testimony. But thus far, we found nothing in the record about the dancer or the incident described in her police report. Agent Shear spent all night searching the city for Scott before being assigned to monitor his sister Susan's house in Escondido on the 18th of April. Shear pulled through the security gate of her exclusive Brookside neighborhood just before Grogan arrived in the city. He watched the house on Lytham Glen from his white Ford Explorer, and things were quiet when he checked in with the surveillance team that morning. Grogan checked into his hotel shortly after, and Scheer expected an uneventful morning as detectives tried to catch up on some sleep. The street lamps went dark in Susan's upscale community when the sun crept over the hills, and Scheer watched a few windows light up along the block shortly after. It was a Friday morning, and several more houses lit up when 6 o'clock rolled around, but not Susan's. He was thrown off a bit when a Mercedes pulled out of her garage a few minutes later. Scheer followed the red Mercedes after it passed him on the street, but didn't get a good look at the driver. He kept his distance as the sedan took the southbound ramp onto I-15 and trailed behind for some time, still uncertain whether Scott was behind the wheel. Scheer already made a call on the radio to check on the car, and miles and minutes passed before he got a call back from Agent Sonia Ramos. She immediately told him not to lose sight of it, that Scott was likely the driver because the red Mercedes was seen on previous surveillance operations. This is a strange comment from Ramos to make, as other witnesses, including Detective Grogan, later testified to having no knowledge of the Mercedes until it pulled out of Susan's garage. What, if anything, that inconsistency might mean isn't clear, but when Scheer learned Scott was the driver, he got on the radio. At 6:45 a.m., he relayed his southbound position on I-15 to the 8 or 9 other agents on duty, along with a description and plate number for the Mercedes. Scheer reminded his colleagues to maintain visual contact with Scott when they found him and not to let him out of their sight, whatever the cost. Moments later, their Mercedes slipped down an off-ramp and disappeared into traffic. We don't know what led Agent Scheer to check John's place in Ocean Beach, but he found Scott a few blocks away from Lotus Street 15 minutes later. It's unknown whether Scott actually stopped and saw his brother before Scheer tracked him down, but most likely not, considering his brief window of opportunity for a visit. But he definitely did stop on the corner of Brighton Avenue and Sunset Cliffs Boulevard when he noticed Scheer's white Explorer behind him again. When zigzagging through Ocean Beach failed to shake the SUV off his trail, Scott abruptly parked and approached a front porch at the end of the block on Brighton. Agent Scheer drove on, but watched in his rearview mirror as Scott dashed back to the car seconds later. He pulled a sharp U-turn and followed the Mercedes northbound on Interstate 5. Between 7:30 and 8 o'clock that morning, Scott took the exit for Solana Beach, where his parents, Jackie and Lee, lived. Again, it's not known if he tried to see them or intended to when he got off the highway, but we know he left the interstate because he led Agent Ramos on a high-speed chase near their house on Santa Sabina Court. She nearly went off the road trying to keep up with their son. Fortunately, Agent Ramos regained control after fishtailing behind Scott and eventually followed him back to the I-5. It's safe to say the DOJ's covert surveillance devolved into a dangerous game of cat and mouse by the time Scott headed back north on I-5. Their agents had orders to match his pace come hell or high water, and they did. But the harder they pushed to stay on his trail, the more brazen Scott's driving became. After just a few hours' sleep, Grogan received a wake-up call from their surveillance team just before the incident with Agent Ramos. He and his colleagues were briefed on the morning's developments and given a radio. They listened to Ramos report her close call, and a stack of others would come in from agents as Scott's erratic driving led them north. Detective Grogan could have arrested him at any point for reckless driving and endangering the public, but he expected confirmation of Laci's DNA would be forthcoming. So long as Scott didn't venture south and get too close to Mexico, Grogan intended to stick to the plan. And so Agent Ramos stuck with the Mercedes along the route back to Interstate 5, where she and her colleagues continued to follow him north all the way into Orange County. It was more than obvious to Scott by the time he left Solana Beach that between 8 and 10 vehicles were following him down the highway, and it wasn't long before he started acting out. He straddled lanes so they couldn't anticipate when and where he would pass or whether he would take an exit. He weaved in and out of traffic and took a few off-ramps, attempting to lose them, but agents were still stuck like glue when Scott reached San Clemente, where the entire group was forced to slow to a crawl as they passed through an immigration checkpoint. Civilian traffic funneled through the gates along with them, and the Mercedes made it back onto the highway first. Scott scrambled away with agents held up at the gates, and he was able to gain some distance, but they caught up moments later. Scott grew more daring as the miles piled up, and his pursuers clearly weren't backing off. When the chase continued past Irvine, more than 80 miles from where it began, he made a perilous move to shake agents off his tail, and it very nearly worked. Scott continued northbound on I-5, but when he approached the outskirts of Santa Ana, the Mercedes unexpectedly swerved towards the guardrail on the inside lane. He barely missed the steel barrier and caught the Red Hill Avenue exit at the last possible second. The group of agents behind him couldn't make the turn, and Scott made it down the off-ramp alone. But he wasn't lonely for long. Agent Shear was far enough back to react when the car broke away and caught up at the cross street moments later. The Mercedes was blocked by traffic when Shear's white Explorer lined up behind it, and Scott's irritation began to show. He mockingly clapped his hands as Shear followed him back up to the highway, a sarcastic congratulations for being able to keep up. Scott's frustration mounted as the pursuit carried on, and his hand signals would soon become far more expressive. His erratic driving escalated after the incident with Shear, and he began speeding excessively through heavier traffic as it picked up near Anaheim. Agents stuck with him as the motley caravan sped north, but safety became a growing concern as they passed Garden Grove. Scott made another sharp cut across the I-5 to reach Highway 57, and once again he barely made the exit. But this time he split 3 lanes of dense traffic to do it, putting more than himself and a guardrail at risk. All 8 to 10 agents made the turn to follow Scott up the ramp, but there were several civilians peppered between them as well. After another close call, the chatter picked up over the radio. Grogan listened in from his hotel as few agents expressed concern over public safety and Scott's unpredictable behavior. None were sure what to expect as they followed him further north, and they were all surprised to see his speed normalize a few minutes later, almost as if he'd heard their complaints. Traffic thinned out and the radio chatter died down after he calmly took the exit for State Road 91 and Northeast Anaheim, and agents serenely followed. Now heading due east, Scott went the speed limit and drove like a normal person for about 40 minutes, but he wasn't done toying with them just yet. He led agents back south on I-15 after the group passed Corona and pulled a few more tricks from his sleeve on the interstate. But in order to keep the game of cat and mouse going, he was definitely going to need more gas. Scott quietly merged onto I-15 south around 9:45 that morning, but his driving pattern radically changed when agents followed him back onto the interstate. Rather than speeding and weaving through traffic to get under their skin, he began randomly hitting the brakes, hard enough to cut his speed in half. The Mercedes pitched back drastically each time, creating a dangerous situation as agents tried to follow suit. Tensions were high and rising by the time they reached Temecula Valley, and when Scott stopped at the Arco station in Temecula proper, between 5 and 7 agents entered the parking lot with him. The remainder held positions nearby while Agent Lindley took pictures of him pumping gas, and another followed Scott into the store to ensure he came out the same door he went in. After the awkward pit stop in Temecula, Scott was ready for more hounds versus hare on the highway. He continued his random brake checks and crossed 2 lanes of traffic to park on the shoulder near Palo Mesa on the way back to San Diego. Soon after, Agent Shear found himself back where he started at 6 o'clock that morning, following Scott south on the I-15 in North San Diego County. After he and his colleagues completed the 4-hour circuit back to Escondido, Scott took the exit for West Valley Parkway, and their strategy appeared to change. The group split up when he got off the interstate, and they surrounded the chase rather than participate as it played out on city streets. Agent Alex Quick followed the Mercedes down the off-ramp alone, and Scott wasted no time trying to lose him. West Valley Parkway turns into Del Dios Road just a few thousand yards off the exit from I-15 and becomes more precarious as it traces further southwest. Del Dios means of God or of the God, and one can easily see how the terrain inspired the name. The road runs along the natural curvature of the Del Dios Highlands before outlining the ridges and cliffs that surround Lake Hodges Gorge and the Santa Fe Valley Preserve. Under normal circumstances, the geography bordering Del Dios makes for a stunning drive, but on that Good Friday, Scott ensured the landscape took Agent Quick's breath away for all the wrong reasons. And the threatening slopes along Lake Hodges Gorge may have summoned a small prayer from them both. The Del Dios is a 2-lane road woven between the peaks and valleys forming the southern foothills of the Santa Rosa Mountains, and it becomes rather narrow and steep in several places. It boasts a generous 55-mile-per-hour speed limit as well, which Scott disregarded entirely. He found the 88-kilometer-per-hour limit was nowhere near fast enough to stop Agent Quick from keeping pace. Scott frantically snaked through the hills and made several attempts to break away, passing the traffic in front of him. But the agent matched every move and never lost sight of the car. Although his palms must have been slick chasing Scott round the curves with not so much as a guardrail between him and the depths of the gorge below, he never once let it show. Quick remained cool, calm, collected, and ever present behind him throughout, which may have tested Scott's patience even more. He gained some ground as the car banked around a wide left hook in the road and displayed his frustration from the driver's side window. Scott made sure Quick got a good long look at his middle finger, quaking a bit in the wind as the Mercedes sped around the bend. A few minutes later, Scott lurched the car over the double line and punched the gas in the oncoming lane to pass a truck, and Agent Quick lost him. But his colleagues listening in on the radio were strategically placed to intercept, and there are only so many outlets off Del Dios Road. One of those offshoots is El Camino Real, and Agent Ernie Lyman was assigned to drive a portion of the highway around 15 minutes into the search. Lyman was speeding a little as he drove along El Camino Real, feeling the pressure to get eyes back on Scott. But he'd only gone a few miles north when an oncoming car blazed past him so fast, all he could catch was the color. It was red. Lyman instantly pulled a U-turn and laid a heavy foot on the gas, but it still took some time for him to catch up and eventually confirm it was Scott. The speed limit on El Camino Real is 35 miles or 56 kilometers per hour, but Lyman had to double that just to keep the Mercedes in view. The next several miles of the historic road is 3 lanes wide and was bustling with activity when Scott burst on the scene. Surrounded by apartments, strip malls, and housing additions, Agent Lyman did his best to wind his car through the traffic without causing an accident, but Scott had no such scruples. He suddenly crossed all 3 lanes on El Camino Real and screeched to a halt on the right side of the road. Whether the move was intended to irritate Lyman or throw him off the trail is unclear, but whatever his motivation, Scott's antics were becoming more dangerous, and Lyman had enough. Special Agent Ernie Lyman was also surveillance team supervisor for the DOJ, and he had Detective Grogan on the radio while he was still chasing Scott down El Camino Real. Both men were running on little sleep and wary after the hours-long harrowing pursuit along 2 of America's deadliest highways that morning, and they both knew Grogan could have pulled the plug and arrested Scott at any time. But Chief Wasden wanted an ID for Laci to come first, so Grogan accepted the risk and held out for news from the lab. However, now that he was careening through busy traffic at double speed on El Camino Real, Grogan gave up on waiting for Laci's DNA. It was time to put an end to the chase before Scott finished it for them. Agent Lyman agreed it was a matter of time before he harmed himself or someone else. Grogan tucked the warrant away in his pocket and piled back in his car with his colleagues. He listened to the radio intently along with Bueller, Brokini, Sergeant Carter, and the 9 other agents on the channel as he drove west toward Scott's position, and Lyman gave a play-by-play of their movement away from El Camino Real. Lyman kept pace as the Mercedes jetted west into Del Mar, flying down Carmel Valley Road with no sign of slowing down. When he reported another risky turn southbound, Grogan told Agent Lyman to hit the lights and siren. Scott stopped immediately when the unmarked car lit up behind him, pulling to the curb along Torrey Pines Road directly in front of the entrance to the Torrey Pines golf course. He was cooperative and handcuffed without incident while agents Shear, Ramos, Quick, Schweitzer, and the rest made their way to the scene. Lyman sat Scott down on the curb as Agent Quick directed traffic around their Mercedes, and they all waited for Detective Grogan to deliver his warrant. The agents trailed behind Scott for 160 dangerous miles or 257 kilometers by the time Grogan put an end to the chase. Chief Wasden wanted the DNA to come first, but they didn't need it to make an arrest. He had a dozen reasons and opportunities to stop Scott during the 4 hours he spent recklessly leading agents along two of the most dangerous highways in the country. But Grogan's decision to pull him off the road spawned from his brief time driving down El Camino Real. But we learned during our research that El Camino Real is no ordinary street. Established during the era of Vistal Spain, it's the oldest road in California by a long stretch. Scouted by soldiers and designated by 18th century viceroys looking to expedite the expansion of New Spain, El Camino Real was utilized to that end, creating an impressive 600-mile-long route up the coast a full century before California existed as a state. Many portions of the road were laid down by indigenous tribes in the form of trade routes and buffalo trails long before the Spanish arrived. Indeed, El Camino Real has a long and fascinating history, but what does that have to do with Scott? Strangely enough, the eerie connections to this historical path run far deeper than one might expect. El Camino Real happened to be one of the last roads Scott would ever drive down, but our research unveils ties to Laci, Connor, and God that would send a shiver up in the atheist's spine. El Camino Real translates to the King's Road or the Royal Road in Spanish, but the name wasn't chosen merely to honor the monarch. The King's Road marked the territorial claim of an ambitious New Spain and made travelers aware that the route fell under the protection of the Spanish crown, a Catholic crown that lay state to the land in the name of God as much as the king's. Scott was baptized and raised Catholic, as was his mother, Jackie, along with her parents before her. Jackie was raised in a Catholic orphanage and went on to send Scott to Catholic schools. His devotion to the church as an adult notwithstanding, he spent a good deal of time working with nuns during high school and volunteered to help several Catholic charities during his youth. Devout or otherwise, the Petersons had a long-standing connection to Catholicism, at least on the Latham side. And growing up Catholic in San Diego, Scott likely learned the history of El Camino Real back in grade school. He likely knew it had been Spanish soldiers who initially scouted the 600-mile length of the King's Road looking to expand and solidify New Spain. He probably also knew that it was Franciscan friars who made the most use of the new passage north. After constructing 21 missions along its 965-kilometer path, it must have felt more like God's road to the friars seeking to spread the Catholic faith. Scott's Catholic background comes to mind as we consider how his devilish behavior on El Camino Real sparked his arrest, and his close proximity to the first mission built on God's road when he was handcuffed outside Torrey Pines. Consecrated to the city's namesake, St. Didacus of Alcala, otherwise known as San Diego, the relocated mission still holds daily mass, just 10 miles away from the spot where Scott sat on the curb. Known as the Mother of All Missions, the building was permanently moved to its current home on 6 Mile Island in 1774 for easy access to the San Diego River. But the mission's original location was closer to the golf course by half, at just 8 kilometers away. And there's more. 600 miles or 965 kilometers north stands the last mission built on El Camino Real, marking the end of God's road. It's just a few miles north of the Richmond Harbor where Laci and Connor were found. Scott was arrested on Good Friday, and although we're fairly certain she wasn't Catholic herself, Laci not only received a funeral mass at St. Joseph's in Modesto, but many called for her to be sainted by the Catholic Church. I call her Santa Laci, Graciela Deloria said as she stood outside Laci's home on May 1st, Deloria and many others began to view Laci as a martyr, feeling like the timing of her Christmas Eve disappearance and recovery just before Easter was a sign from God. "All martyrs are saints," she said. "I ask her to help my family members in the other world." When Deloria spoke of Connor, her voice dropped to a whisper. A baby leaving its mother's womb after death is a miracle. Graciela wasn't alone expressing her veneration and spiritual connection to Laci, and the memorial outside the house on Covina evolved into a shrine. A bow of lit candles spanned the front of the house as Easter lilies, crosses, rosaries, and icons of Mary and Jesus overtook the lawn. Even after neighbors complained and the shrine was removed, a steady stream of visitors still came to the house, many of them to pray. 33-year-old plumber Jose Orozco was one of them. Jose would visit Laci's home with his wife and son regularly. Like many others, he believed her spirit still lingered there. "She's not here physically," Jose said, "but I think her soul keeps coming back here." He gazed at Laci's picture window, seeing the reflection of his 2-year-old son, Jose Jr., wrapped safe in his arms. "Maybe she's watching us," he said. "Maybe she sees that we love her." Father Joseph Ilo performed Laci and Connor's funeral mass at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, but he began hearing pleas for her sainthood soon after they were found. Of course, Laci will most likely never be venerated as a saint, but Father Ilo wasn't surprised by the requests, saying, quote, "The human psyche aspires to greatness, to the mystical. Laci's death means more than the death of a housewife in Modesto. It's as if a great gift was taken away at Christmas and returned on Good Friday. On that day, Laci assumed the identity of the crucified one." End quote. From a religious perspective, it's easy to see how one might get carried away on the undercurrent of such a momentous concept. But Father Ilo also understood that the largest connection to Laci and Connor had nothing to do with their greatness, but how ordinary they actually were, saying, quote, "If this kind of tragedy can happen to a regular Modestan, a person from hometown America, this reminds people that we all can die. When we pray for her, really, we are praying for ourselves." End quote. Laci wasn't actually found on Good Friday, but 4 days prior, and it was Scott's arrest that took place the day Jesus was crucified. But we forgive Father Ilo for the mistake. Scott was handcuffed at 11:10 a.m. outside the Torrey Pines golf course on the 18th of April 2003, and we'll soon get to the long list of strange things found in his car, but one item stands out as particularly bizarre. Scott had a ticket stub in his wallet from the San Diego Museum of Art dated the 17th. While we can't prove or disprove he saw his stripper girlfriend the day before his arrest, apparently Scott had a taste for a more cultured exhibition during his final hours as a free man. The exhibit on display at the museum that day? The Grandeur of Visual Mexico, a collection of artwork produced during the 18th century expansion of New Spain, works created within the same time frame and regions as the missions along El Camino Real. Agent Quick directed traffic around the Torrey Pines golf course while Scott waited on the curb for Detective Grogan to arrive. He'd gotten Quick's attention sometime after being sat there to ask the same question he had for Schweitzer and Coble 2 days before. What agency were they with? Quick finally told him the truth, that they worked for the Department of Justice and that detectives from Modesto would soon be arriving to speak with him. Scott hung his head for a few moments, but then lifted his eyes to ask, "Have they found my wife and son?" Quick diverted the question to Grogan, who arrived moments later, but it's not clear if or how he answered it. Grogan's interaction with Scott was short but sweet. He read the charges from the warrant with John Bueller, Al Brocchini, and Sergeant Carter by his side, and the three followed agents who transported Scott and the Mercedes to the DOJ office in downtown San Diego. Detective John Bueller cataloged the contents of the car while Grogan tried to figure out where it came from. And Scott? Well, Scott apologized to Agent Sonia Ramos. He said he was very sorry for nearly causing her to wreck that morning, that he didn't mean any harm and thought she and the other agents were with the media. Of course, Ramos knew he'd asked Coble and Schweitzer what agency they were with, not which network they worked for, and she had no doubt he knew that they were law enforcement. We don't know whether or not she accepted the apology. As for the Mercedes, we can recall that slip from Agent Scheer on the stand, telling the jury that Ramos had details on the car from previous surveillance. And we can recall Grogan telling the jury he knew nothing about the car until Scheer found it on the 16th. We're not quite sure what this means or when police may have really learned about the car, but we do know Scott saw Michael Griffin's ad on the 12th of April and bought the Mercedes the same day. However, it hadn't been his first choice. Scott tried to buy a 1990 Saab convertible from Mario Ruvalcaba the day before, but the deal fell through. Mario had a verbal agreement to sell the Saab to a woman from Vegas before Scott even came to see it on the 11th. But because he was local with cash in hand and offering $100 more than the buyer in Vegas, Mario tried to call the woman to cancel the deal. When she didn't answer, he drew up a bill of sale for Scott, settling on a purchase price of $2,400. After completing the paperwork, Mario told Scott to return the following day to pick up the emissions certificate. He had the car smog certified 2 months before, but didn't have the verification on hand. It's illegal to drive in California without it, and so, rather than pay the annual fee himself or risk getting a ticket, Scott agreed to return the next day to pick up the car. According to Mario, the woman from Vegas called right after he left. She was already halfway to San Diego to purchase the Saab and begged him not to sell it before she could get there. Mario sold the car to the woman before Scott returned to pick it up on the 12th, for $100 less. When detectives later asked Mario about the bill of sale written out to Jacqueline Peterson, he said he didn't notice until after Scott left on the 11th, but when he saw it, assumed he probably wasn't straight. When Mario sold the Saab out from under him, Scott returned to the auto trader where he found Michael Griffin's ad for the Mercedes. He met Michael, drove the car, and quickly agreed to buy it for $3,600. But when they went up to Michael's apartment to do the paperwork, things got weird. Scott gave a fake number from his non-existent Florida driver's license for registration with the DMV and listed the new owner as Jacqueline Peterson. Of course, Michael didn't know the license number was fake and never asked to see Scott's ID, but he had questions about the woman's name on the forms. He asked if that was Scott's name or if he was buying the car for his wife. "No, that's my name," he said. Then Michael thought it might be French, asking if it was pronounced Jacques or something similar, but again, Scott said no, explaining, "It's kind of a boy named Sue type of thing. That's what my parents hung me with. I go by Jack." With the paperwork complete, Scott laid out 36 $100 bills on the table and left to give Michael time to gather his things from the car. One of his brothers drove him back to pick up the Mercedes an hour later, and Michael didn't see Scott again until he testified at his trial. But he didn't do such a great job cleaning out the car and got a call from police soon after Scott's arrest. We'll discuss what Michael left behind along with an exhaustive list of the items found in the Mercedes and more drama from the families leading up to Scott's arraignment. We'll cover Laci and Connor's memorial and hear Sharon's thoughts on seeing Scott in a courtroom for the first time. The bulk of our next episode will focus on Scott's trial, but we have plans to release a detailed news update covering the status of his recent appeals before then, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the episode, give it a thumbs up before you go, and as always, until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.